Have you ever found yourself in a discussion where, even after saying everything you thought mattered, you walked away feeling like you lost? That strange weight in your chest, that knot in your throat, as if every word you spoke only pushed you further away from your own power. Maybe you've been surrounded by people who interrupt, belittle, and dominate rooms like they own the air. Loud voices with shallow thoughts, arrogance in disguise, pretending to be confidence. And somewhere deep down, you might have believed that not responding was weakness, that silence meant surrender, that if you didn't defend yourself, you were giving up. But what if I told you that's the trap? What if the real power was never in your defense, but in your restraint? Nietzsche, one of the most brutally honest thinkers in history, understood something most people still run from. Those who talk too much give too much away. Those desperate to explain themselves are already at a disadvantage. The moment you feel compelled to prove your point, you've already lost ground, because the real fight isn't out there. It's in here, inside you. We live in a world that worships noise. You're taught to debate, to argue, to clap back, to win with words, as if every conversation is a battlefield and the last voice standing owns the truth. But nature, Nietzsche believed, doesn't operate on that level. Nature favors the predator that doesn't announce its next move. The wolf doesn't bark before it strikes. Silence isn't emptiness. Silence is presence. It makes people uneasy. It throws them off balance. It confronts them with themselves. Silence is the space where lies lose their footing. This video is for you, the one who's been dismissed, overshadowed, talked over, misunderstood. The one who walks away from conversations asking, "Why do I always feel like I disappeared?" You've been told your silence made you small. What if it was actually your superpower? Because silence isn't the absence of a fight. Sometimes it's the kill shot. Let's break the illusion. Why do we feel such a raw need to respond, to correct, to prove? Because we've been trained to fear being seen as weak, conditioned to believe that silence is losing, that if we don't react, we'll be walked over. But that impulse to react, that's not strength. That's fear dressed in armor. Nietzsche saw right through it. He said most people don't argue for truth. They argue for control. They argue to keep their belief system from crumbling. The louder the defense, the weaker the foundation. When you explain yourself to people who aren't listening, you're not clarifying truth. You're handing them your energy. You're trying to win a game that was never fair to begin with. Because when you react, you're not free. You're a puppet pulled by the strings of their tone, their words, their ego. But what happens when you don't react? The energy shifts. Suddenly, they're the ones trying to figure you out. This is not passive. This is not avoidance. This is strategic dominance. Nietzsche talked about the herd morality, a mindset built on needing others to approve of you, wanting to be seen as good, correct, balanced. But that approval comes with a cost, and the cost is you. You lose your edge when you live to be liked. You lose your power when your silence is driven by fear instead of choice. The strongest person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who doesn't flinch when misunderstood, the one who doesn't panic when the silence stretches, the one who doesn't need to prove a damn thing. Silence, real silence, is a weapon. And not just a shield, it's a blade. When you stop responding, people start projecting their own doubts, their own weaknesses, their own insecurities. And in that silence, they begin to unravel. Nietzsche knew this. He warned that when you enter the debate, you've already conceded because you're playing their game and they set the rules. But if you don't step in, if you stay grounded, focused, and still, you force them to face themselves. That's why silence is feared. It makes people confront what they usually drown out with noise. So how do you channel that kind of strength? Nietzsche gave us a model, the Ubermensch, the Overman, a person who doesn't live by the rules handed to them, who doesn't chase validation, who transcends herd thinking. The Übermensch isn't reactive. He doesn't care if you misunderstand him. He doesn't need your agreement. He shapes the world through presence alone. No arguments, no defenses, just stillness that screams, I know who I am. And that is terrifying to people who don't. The Ubermensch walks into a room and says nothing and shifts the atmosphere, not because he's trying to impress anyone, but because his silence commands attention. And not the cheap kind of attention, but the kind that says, this person can't be moved. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't over-explain. He doesn't react. He studies. He waits. And when he speaks, if he speaks, it cuts deeper than 1,000 words. His silence is a pressure. It tightens the space. It reveals the masks people wear. Because while others talk to fill the void, he becomes the void. That's the kind of silence that shakes people at their core. But that raises a real question. Why does silence make people so uncomfortable? Why do people start stammering, over-explaining, or getting defensive the moment you don't respond? Because in that vacuum, they're left alone with their thoughts. And most people don't like their thoughts. Modern psychology backs this. Social silence in conflict is perceived as judgment, even if you're not judging. When you're quiet, the other person loses control of the narrative. And without your resistance, they start projecting their own doubts onto your stillness. The brain literally panics. The amygdala, the part that handles fear, lights up. Questions flood their mind. Are they judging me? Did I say something wrong? Do they know I'm full of it? That's when silence becomes a scalpel. It cuts clean without ever being seen. And that brings us to one more truth Nietzsche saw before science could measure it. People don't speak to connect. They often speak to protect, to cover the gap between who they pretend to be and who they really are. And silence exposes that gap. So when you say nothing, you're not just listening, you're breaking the illusion. And here's the kicker. Manipulators hate silence. They depend on your reactions to feel powerful. Your energy feeds their game. But when you stop reacting, the game collapses, the mask slips, they panic. Because silence, real, chosen, powerful silence, reveals them. But there's something deeper, more uncomfortable. Silence doesn't just mess with others, it messes with you. Because when you stay silent in the heat of the moment, it's not just about power, it's about endurance. You're fighting the reflex to explain yourself, to protect your ego, to jump in and reclaim control. And that's the hardest war of all, the one against your own reactions. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It's restraint loaded with intention. But what if your silence hasn't been conscious at all? What if your silence isn't power, but surrender in disguise? There's a darker side to all of this, a side that Nietzsche knew all too well. When silence becomes your habit, not because you choose it, but because you've been trained to believe that your voice doesn't matter. There's a silence that protects you, and there's a silence that erases you. You start to convince yourself that conflict is immature, that being above it is wisdom, that peace matters more than truth. But what if that's just the conditioning talking? There are people out there building empires on your quiet, taking more than they give, speaking louder, standing taller, not because they're better, but because they know you won't push back. And when you don't push back, they stop seeing you. Let's get brutal. If you're always the one who lets it go, who doesn't want drama, who keeps the peace, eventually, you disappear from your own story. That's not mastery. That's invisible surrender. Nietzsche warned us about this. He called it the morality of slaves. a value system created by the weak to survive among the strong. It teaches you to be humble, to avoid conflict, to suppress your desire to rise, and it wraps it all in the illusion of virtue. But that kind of silence isn't sacred, it's suffocating. It's what makes you feel guilty for wanting more, ashamed for taking up space, nervous to speak your truth, and grateful when others don't trample you, when in fact they shouldn't be trampling you at all. Here's the hard truth. That's not kindness. That's programming. You've been taught to shrink, smile, nod. You've been taught that silence equals maturity, but in reality, that kind of silence is often a trained response to dominance. And Nietzsche, he didn't write for the silenced. He wrote for the ones ready to burn that script. To step into the version of yourself that doesn't ask for respect, but walks into a room and receives it without a word. So how do you go from the silence of submission to the silence of presence? It starts by breaking the cycle. You stop explaining yourself to people who only listen to win. You stop reacting when the bait is obvious. You stop measuring your worth by how comfortable you make other people feel. And you start letting your silence become a statement. Not a blank space, not avoidance. A declaration. This is where I end, and you don't get to cross. You don't have to shout to draw the line. You just have to stop stepping back. This is how you reclaim your power without saying a word. You practice stillness on purpose, not because you're scared, but because you are unbothered. And that unbothered silence, it's louder than any argument. When someone tries to provoke you, don't flinch. When someone plays emotional chess, don't make the first move. When someone starts posturing, let them. Then hold your silence like it's loaded. Because it is. Let it grow. Let it stretch. Let it sit in the room like smoke. Watch how people start to squirm under the weight of their own words. Because people expect noise. And when they don't get it, they lose their rhythm. That's when you win. Here's something most will never understand. Silence is a luxury. Only the secure can afford it. Only the powerful can sit inside it and not crumble. But there's one more level. Silence not just as a defense, but as creation. The Ubermensch in Nietzsche's eyes didn't just resist the world, he redefined it. He didn't live reacting, he lived becoming. While the herd fought over status and morality and being right, the Übermensch stepped outside the entire system and created his own. Not through debate, not through argument, through presence, through stillness, through a kind of silence that could only come from deep inner clarity. And this is the final transformation. When you don't just stay silent to protect yourself, you stay silent because you are building something. And you know that explaining it to people who aren't ready will only cheapen it. You become someone who doesn't reveal everything. Someone who doesn't need applause to keep moving. Someone who holds truth like fire, but doesn't have to show the flame to feel the heat. That's the Ubermensch silence. The kind that creates, the kind that disturbs the room without saying a word. And here's the last question I'll leave you with. Are you using your silence to hide or to rise? Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who know when to speak and when to simply be. This isn't about pretending to be untouchable. This is about becoming someone who doesn't need to be understood to feel complete. Someone who can walk through the chaos of the world without breaking, because their silence isn't a void. It's a weapon, a boundary, a truth. So now ask yourself, what kind of silence do you practice? The silence that disappears, or the silence that shakes the room? If you're ready to choose the second, say it out loud. Type it, claim it. I choose the silence that commands respect. Not for show, not for drama, for you. Because this silence isn't the end of your voice. It's the beginning of your power. And from now on, let every moment of your silence speak louder than anyone else's noise.